Thank you for being here with us this morning for a press conference with NDP Leader Jagmeet Singh and the MP for Victoria, Laurel Collins. We'll take questions at the end, beginning with questions in the room. Merci de nous rejoindre ce matin pour une conférence de presse avec le chef du NPD Jagmeet Singh et la députée de Victoria, Laurel Collins. On va prendre des questions à la fin, commençant avec des questions des personnes présentes. Turn it over to you, Laurel.
Thank you. My name is Laurel Collins. I'm the MP for Victoria, and I'm grateful to be here on the homelands of Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And whenever we acknowledge the land that we are on, it's an important opportunity to not only acknowledge the injustice that Indigenous communities still face, but also to commit to action to fight alongside the communities who are impacted for justice. And it is wonderful to welcome Jagmeet back to Victoria. He spent a lot of time in our community, and it is wonderful to have him here. We've been hearing from people about the struggles they're facing with the rising cost of living, access to healthcare, and finding an affordable home. And Jagmeet is the only leader on the Hill who isn't listening to billionaire CEOs and the biggest corporations. He's listening to people in our community and communities across Canada, people who are struggling. And when we are back in Ottawa on Monday, when the House resumes, know that Jagmeet and our whole NDP team will be fighting for you. And it is my pleasure to introduce the leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you, Laurel. We're so lucky to have an incredible MP like Laurel here in Victoria fighting for people. And I want you to know, as Laurel said, we hear you. We hear that people are feeling squeezed. I want to start off by acknowledging that today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and that it is so important for us to remain vigilant, to fight anti-Semitism wherever it rears its head. We were able to visit, my team and I were able to visit Berlin recently, and we visited some of the Holocaust memorial sites. And it is important to remember how insidious hate is and how it worked its way into society in Germany, and how we must all be very vigilant in all that we do to fight anti-Semitism. Today, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about healthcare and about the cost of living, particularly rent. With healthcare, we've been hearing from lots of people across the island how they're feeling squeezed and how they're feeling like they can't get the care they need. And while the BC NDP is taking some really bold steps to deal with the healthcare crisis with innovative ways of bringing back more public care and fighting against private care, they need a partner. They need someone who's willing to also stand up for public universal healthcare. And so far, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, hasn't been taking the healthcare crisis seriously. What we've been hearing from families, they can't get a healthcare primary care doctor. They can't get a family doctor. Emergency rooms are often shut down. It's so long when you go to an emergency room to get care. And the major problem that has been identified is a shortage of healthcare workers. These workers need respect. These workers need to be properly compensated, and we need to make sure we're recruiting and training more healthcare workers. That's the solution, not the solution of conservative premiers like those in Alberta and Ontario who want to privatize and bring in more for-profit care, because we know for-profit care will just cannibalize the public sector. It'll pull workers away from the public ER rooms and make the wait times even longer. It is not going to solve the problem. So while the Prime Minister has been applauding private for-profit delivery in Ontario and not taking the crisis seriously, the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, has also been cheering on the privatization and the for-profit clinics, which again will make things worse. Democrats are committed to finding solutions, and we pushed hard to have the Prime Minister finally meet with the premiers. After months and months, that meeting is happening, which is a good thing. But we would say very clearly, if the agreement with the provinces doesn't include a commitment to hire thousands of more healthcare workers, including nurses, doctors, and frontline healthcare workers, then that agreement would be a failure. We need to make sure we're addressing the real problem, which is a shortage of healthcare workers. New Democrats are committed to that solution because families depend on healthcare. It should be there for you when you need it. That's what we're fighting for. When it comes to the cost of living, we've seen another increase from the Bank of Canada. So now the interest rates are at 4.5%. It has been a very sharp and very rapid increase in interest rates, and that has just made things even worse. The whole purpose of tackling inflation should be to make life easier for people. And the Bank of Canada's approach, supported by by the government of Canada is not actually making life better for people. In fact, with the interest rates going up, it's made mortgages more expensive, and it's also driven up the cost of rent. We're seeing rent across the country increase on an average by 18%. Here in Victoria, we're hearing that if you leave your current place and move to a new place, the increase can be as high as 30%, and the average increase is around 8%. That is very hard for families that are already feeling the squeeze of grocery prices that are going up, the cost of everything going up. So if the Prime Minister really wants to take inflation seriously and take the housing crisis seriously, what he needs to do is two things. He needs to massively invest in building more homes that are affordable for families. And that means investing in places for people to rent or to buy, looking at cooperatives and not-for-profit housing, but massively investing in building more homes that people can actually afford. And secondly, we need to tackle the fact that our housing market is being used like a stock market by ultra-wealthy corporations and CEOs who see it as a place to make money, not a place for people to find a home that they can afford. We need to change that. New Democrats are committed to making that happen. Donc, aujourd'hui, je veux commencer en reconnaissant qu'aujourd'hui, c'est la journée de la commémoration de l'Holocauste. C'est vraiment important qu'on reste vigilant pour faire face à l'antisémitisme, parce que si la haine commence, c'est quelque chose on a vu les impacts. Donc, c'est important de rester vigilant contre l'antisémitisme, et c'est un engagement de notre parti. Aujourd'hui, je veux toucher deux enjeux. Je veux parler de deux enjeux. Premièrement, c'est le système de santé. Deuxièmement, c'est le coût de la vie qui augmente. Avec le système de santé, c'est clair qu'on a une crise à travers le pays, et la crise est le résultat d'une pénurie de travailleurs de santé. Les premiers ministres conservateurs veulent investir dans la privatisation à but lucratif de notre système de santé, et c'est la mauvaise chose à faire parce que ça va empirer les problèmes. Ça va cannibaliser les travailleurs dans le système public, et ça va faire en sorte que les problèmes vont exaspérer. Ça va créer plus de problèmes. Donc, nous sommes les défendeurs de notre système de santé publique. Ici, en Colombie-Britannique, le gouvernement provincial a pris des mesures importantes pour faire face à cette crise, mais ils ont besoin d'un partenaire au niveau fédéral. Au lieu des propositions de privatisation de Doug Ford et Daniel Smith, on propose qu'on investe pour embaucher plus de travailleurs de santé. Ça, c'est primordial. Donc, on a exigé le gouvernement fédéral, le Premier ministre, de rencontrer les premiers ministres des provinces. Et après des mois, finalement, il a annoncé qu'il va rencontrer les premiers ministres. Mais si l'entente n'inclut pas un engagement d'aider avec augmenter les personnels de travail de santé, ça va être un échec. Donc, on encourage des vraies solutions pour ce problème. Finalement, je veux toucher le sujet du coût de la vie qui augmente. On sait que le coût d'épicerie augmente, mais en particulier, le coût de logement augmente aussi. Et avec la Banque du Canada qui a augmenté les taux d'intérêt, ça a fait en sorte que le problème est encore pire parce que c'est plus cher pour les hypothèques et les loyers ont aussi augmenté. Si le Premier ministre veut vraiment faire face à ce problème, il doit investir massivement pour construire plus de logements abordables, et il doit aussi régler le problème dans le marché de immobilier, le marché des logements, où les grandes corporations veulent faire des grands profits, et ça nuit les familles qui ne peuvent pas trouver des logements abordables. On doit changer les règlements pour aider les familles. Et c'est exactement ce que les néo-démocrates veulent faire. Merci. Thank you so much. With that, I'm ready for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jagmeet. If you have a question on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. Si vous avez des questions, utilisez la fonction lever la main. I'll turn it over to you, James, for questions in the room.
Okay, we're going to start with the Vancouver Sun.
Jagmeet, on the eve of decriminalization of simple possession in BC, Health Canada is looking for metrics that BC, the government, has to provide. However, the chief coroner has said we can't expect decriminalization alone to reduce deaths from the opioid crisis. So what else would you like to see, since the rest of the country will be looking at BC's experimentation with decriminalization?
What we've heard from a long time is that when people who are dealing with addiction or people who are impacted by the toxic drug supply, there are a number of things that they're faced with. One is mental health concerns, so we need to provide supports for mental health. People need supports to deal with their addiction, so rehabilitation services are also very important. We know that there are a number of issues that all impact people who are losing their lives to the toxic drug supply. And ultimately, the approach has to be, the question we need to ask ourselves is do we want to save lives? And if we want to save lives, the evidence that we know, the evidence that we have is that the criminal approach to dealing with someone who is struggling with a toxic drug supply or someone who is struggling with addiction, that the criminal approach has not worked. So let's not continue to do the same thing that hasn't worked. I applaud BC for taking this bold step to say we need to address this crisis with compassion, with healthcare, and with the goal of actually saving lives. And that's something that I think BC has shown some great leadership. And now they need a federal partner who's also going to provide that support for mental health supports, rehabilitation supports, and dealing with the addiction.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, please. In Oregon, the decriminalization experiment came with hundreds of millions of dollars in treatment funding. In the federal election, the government had promised to create a transfer for mental health and addiction funds, and we haven't seen that. So what can BC and the rest of the country do to shore up the treatment system so that if people get the supports, they can go into treatment without wait lists?
It's absolutely right that the Liberal government, Prime Minister Trudeau, made a promise to increase mental health and addiction supports and has not fulfilled that promise. We're going to continue to put pressure on him to follow through in that promise because that would be very fundamental in helping BC with the treatment side, with making sure that there's access to programs to help people who need that support, need that help. And again, while the approach of compassion is absolutely the right approach, it also needs to include supports around treatment, rehabilitation, mental health services, addiction services, so that we can actually provide people with the care they need.
We'll go to CTV next.
Hi, Anna with CTV Vancouver Island. You compared the rental market to the stock market there. What are your thoughts on implementing a vacancy cap so landlords can't jack the rent way up once someone moves out?
We need to look at lots of different solutions. When it comes to the housing crisis, first we have to acknowledge that things are really bad. Like people are really struggling with the existing rent that they have, and the fact that the rent is going up is just making it even harder. And for people who have to leave their homes, whether they've been rent evicted or they are growing their families, to find a new place is literally impossible. And people are staying in a home that doesn't really make sense for their family needs because they're afraid that if I go to another place, I'm going to have to pay 30% higher rent. So we need to look at all solutions. Different measures around rent control are on the provincial side, and I'm open to looking at tools that help keep people in their homes in an affordable way. But where I'm putting my focus on is really the two other areas that I think the federal government can play a really important role. And that's building, like massively building more homes and apartments and a mix of places where people can find rent or an ability to own places that are in their budget. So we need to see massive investments there. But we also need to change the market because the market has been designed in a way that it benefits wealthy corporations. It shouldn't be that a first-time family or a first-time home buyer has to compete with $1 billion corporation that's buying homes or apartments because they see it as a profit-making scheme. They shouldn't be pushing out a family that wants to start and grow their family. That is a problem that we're up against. And there's changes that we can make that will disincentivize or discourage these wealthy corporations from competing with families that are just trying to find a home.
Do you have a follow-up?
I do. To healthcare, you mentioned obviously the need to hire thousands of healthcare workers. The question is, though, where the heck are these people going to come from?
Very important question. So there's a number of things that we need to do. When speaking with healthcare workers, they first highlighted we also need to focus on retaining what we have because a lot of healthcare workers are leaving the profession because of the difficult work conditions. They're being overworked. They're being under-resourced. So we need to retain what we have. And then in the recruitment process, there's a couple of different things we need to do. One, there's healthcare workers that have left the profession that we need to find ways to bring back. There's healthcare workers that we need to assist them in encouraging them to lengthen their careers so they can find ways of contributing in a meaningful way where we can ask them to come back and help out. There's also ways of us unlocking the potential of the thousands and thousands of Canadians who are in our country with international training And that training, it's been so difficult for them to have that training recognized in Canada. We need to streamline that process. We need to make sure that's easier. We can maintain good quality, but there has to be an easier way for people that have international training to be able to work in the fields that they're trained to work in, particularly when we're dealing with a crisis. So there's lots of solutions there. We just need a government that's going to take this as a priority, make this a serious priority. We also finally can fast track the immigration status of healthcare workers. We know that there's many healthcare workers in the country who can't work because of an immigration barrier. We need to fix that. And then when we are looking to new Canadians, people who want to immigrate to Canada, we should also look to connecting those that have international medical training and finding ways to speed up their immigration into Canada so that we can deal with this crisis. Again, there are solutions, but so far at the federal level, Prime Minister Trudeau hasn't taken this seriously and hasn't responded with the urgency that it demands.
We're going to go to the Victoria News next.
Hi, Ella with Victoria News. Kind of adding on to the last question. Speaking to the students that have already done their schooling here and who are graduated in the medical field, a lot of them happen to move to the States or somewhere else because they're getting underpaid. Is there any way that you're keeping them there, or any way you're going to pay them more here, or what ways are you going to, or how are you going to keep them here?
It's a very important question. We were hearing that from a lot of new graduates, that seeing the conditions of work, seeing how difficult it is in Canada, many are choosing not to work in Canada. So we can't allow that to happen. We have to find ways to give better compensation. Absolutely. That's something that the Prime Minister actually promised for personal support workers, for frontline healthcare workers, to increase their pay. We need to find ways to properly compensate these healthcare workers. That's first. We can absolutely do that. We need to find ways to incentivize Canadian-trained healthcare workers to stay in Canada, whether that's through different tax credits or other supports or incentives to get these community members to work in communities that need them. We also need to look at ways of streamlining the training process. A lot of healthcare workers have mentioned that some of the training is taking too long, and it doesn't have to be that long. There's ways to shorten the time period so we can have these workers actually get to work sooner. And a lot of the concern is around healthcare workers not getting trained to be able to work in hospitals. And a lot of frontline healthcare workers don't want to become business owners. They want to actually provide healthcare. So we have to find ways to ensure that they can work in a way that allows them to do what they do best without having to worry about starting up a business. So we need to streamline that as well.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah. What ways do you plan on shortening those programs so that they can get into the workforce faster? And same with, immigrants, how do you plan to, shorten their process so they can quickly get into the work field coming from another country?
Well, with the training and curriculum, this is something that healthcare experts that I've spoken with have said there needs to be a streamlining or an acceleration of the training process so we can get the workers working quicker. One example was given is that for family practitioners in Canada, the family medicine training there's a proposal to lengthen it. And that's something that healthcare workers are saying is a bad idea. It's going to make it even more difficult for people to enter into family practice. So that would be something that we would encourage the healthcare experts and the licensing bodies to work together to find ways to create a curriculum that is not going to take longer for a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare worker to get into the field, give them the adequate and appropriate training, but do it in a way that's quick as possible. And then with the recognizing internationally trained Canadians, the licensing bodies right now, there's a lot of complexity. We've got a national licensing and then there's also provincial licensing. There has to be a way for us to streamline that. And there's been some discussion in other provinces of finding a way to have a national license where people can work across provincial borders. That would actually help as well to create some more flexibility so workers can actually provide care in multiple provinces. But these are some of the solutions we need to look to. How can we make sure our healthcare workers are able to provide their skills to communities in the best way possible, in the quickest way possible, and satisfy the needs of people? And these are some of the solutions we're looking at.
We're going to go to Capital Daily next.
Hi, this is Brishti from Capital Daily. For several years now, healthcare workers in BC have been scared to publicly talk about what's actually happening inside hospitals. They're afraid of facing discipline, and there have been disciplinary actions taken. Do you have a policy plan or message to make sure that healthcare workers are not prevented from speaking out about things like dangerous staffing levels and the impacts on themselves and patients?
We did a number of roundtable meetings along the island, and in that meeting, one of the themes that came up from the healthcare workers was this idea of respect, and that healthcare workers need to be respected and their work needs to be valued. A part of respect and value is to listen to them and to hear them out, and to make sure that healthcare workers can talk about their experiences and talk about the problems, because they often have a lot of solutions. So I want to encourage that. I think it's important for us to create a climate where healthcare workers can talk about what's not working, and we listen to them about how we can fix those problems, and listen to them around the solutions that they might have. And that's a part of that respect that healthcare workers need. We need to respect them by making sure they can be compensated appropriately, respect them by listening to their concerns, and value them by making sure they're at the table when we're making decisions. These are some of the things that we can do that would make sure that healthcare workers feel not just this idea that we appreciate them, but we actually respect them in a concrete way.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. In most parts of BC, people need to wait several months for access to a publicly funded addiction treatment facility. The province has funded a few peer-assisted mental health teams to respond to mental health calls, and there's only one federally funded safe supply program in Victoria. These are all mental health and toxic drug crisis responses, but advocates say that they're not enough to respond to the crisis that we have now. Do you believe BC should be investing more in mental health care, treatment, and first response?
So the response so far, BC is trying to do its best with the resources that it has, and that's why the federal promise, Justin Trudeau's, Prime Minister Trudeau's promise of specifically a mental health transfer is so important. Given the toxic drug supply, given the addictions crisis, given the mental health crisis across our country, it is absolutely clear that we need to be investing more in mental health. And that promise that the Prime Minister made was years ago, and he still hasn't delivered on it. And we're seeing the impacts of that. People are not getting the care they need. And on a really personal note, my father struggled with an addiction, and the only way he was able to get through that addiction was a publicly funded rehabilitation center. We were in a really tough spot financially. We didn't have any money left. And if there was not a publicly funded option, my dad would have nowhere to go. And it literally saved his life. We went, and at that moment, if someone who's dealing with addiction needs help and says, I want that help now, and you can't find a bed for them or a spot for them, you've missed that window. And we were really lucky that when my dad wanted help and made that decision, we were able to find a publicly funded spot that literally saved his life. And I know so many families are right now wondering, where can we find a place for our child, our loved one, our brother, our sister, our friend. And that's something that I don't want anyone to have to worry about, and why we're fighting so hard to make sure that mental health funding is delivered and we can publicly fund rehabilitation, addiction services, mental health services, so that people can get the care they need.
This concludes our press conference today. Ceci met fin à notre conférence de presse. Thank you. Goodbye.
Go for it.
Thank you. Just during your time on Vancouver Island, for you, what really stood out? What was kind of the main takeaway after meeting with communities around the island?
We had two kind of general themes, so I feel like that might have skewed a bit of the discussions. But I think these are the concerns that most people have: cost of living and healthcare. That they stuck out in a really personal way. Like, I heard from people throughout the island that said, we love our communities and we love being here, but we can't find a healthcare worker. We can't find a doctor. People told me about the fact that they can't get into an emergency room and just the pressures they feel. So that healthcare was a big one. And we know that the provincial government is taking some important steps, but really the federal government has to step up as well. And since the federal government's been cutting its funding, and that's really made things worse. So that was a big theme. And the other one was the cost of living: groceries, bills, rent, housing. Just the cost of living is really pressuring people. They're feeling squeezed. They're feeling like, what do I do? I'm doing everything right. I'm working hard, but it just gets harder every week to buy groceries. Like, the same things I bought one week, I go in the next week and it's more expensive. So it really was that feeling like, what do I do? And that's why we're saying to people, like, there's things we can do. We know that corporate greed is driving up some of the cost of living. We know that with grocery stores, the corporate chains, they're making huge profits, and people are feeling squeezed, and we can't allow them to be exploiting people in this way. And so we're proposing things like that UK and Spain and Germany have done around an excess profit tax, so that we can disincentivize the ripping off of people. So these are some of the things we heard. There's cost of living and healthcare.
Can we throw a couple of questions your way, Emily?
You okay? Yeah, I think, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just curious about your thoughts on the potential vacancy cap. What do you make of that? It's something a lot of folks who work with unhoused people or people who are even middle income they're proposing.
Yeah, I agree with what Jagmeet said. I think we need to look at all the options. We are hearing from constituents here in Victoria that housing is it's so unaffordable, whether it's people struggling to pay for their rent or their mortgage payments or people who don't have a roof over their head at night. The housing crisis is impacting everyone in our community. And so, at the federal level, we absolutely need to be looking at every option. And specifically, we need to be tackling the financialization of the housing market. Yeah. We've seen this impacting people in our community who are trying to buy a home for the first time. They are bidding against wealthy investors, these big corporations, and they don't have a chance to actually get into the housing market. People have given up on the dream of ever owning a home, and instead are now at the whim of a rental market where their housing is insecure, where their rent is very high, and where they're struggling to make ends meet. This is utterly unacceptable. And we expect our federal government to be supporting people in this, to be building housing, and to be looking at all those options.
We have time for one more question, if you'd like to Laurel Collins. Okay.
This just has to do, either of you can answer the question, but this has to do with more the cost of living on the island here, specifically in Victoria. It's higher than Vancouver's, but that's because not because of the rent, because it's higher in Vancouver, but it's because of the cost of transportation for food. Is there any ways that you plan on, because most of the food it's transported still largely by ships overseas like that. Is there any ways you plan on, making that cost decrease, or any ways that we can lessen that cost?
Do you want to jump?
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, there's a couple of things. So one we mentioned, and it's a really powerful solution, this idea of putting in an excess profit tax. While there are higher costs, absolutely living on an island, we've looked at the evidence in front of us when it comes to the cost of groceries. And what we're seeing is that while the inflation has definitely driven up some costs, we've seen that grocery stores have increased their prices beyond their increased costs. So they're making these huge profits, and they're publishing the profits. So we can get at these corporations that are making these huge profits and ripping off people by putting a excess profit tax in place that disincentivizes or discourages them from ripping off people. The other solution around the high cost of transporting food is looking at some more food security on the island. And to do that, a couple of things we're looking at is how do we encourage and support agriculture to grow enough food in our communities so we're not relying so much on importing food, that we actually can grow enough food domestically. That's one of the ways where we can bring down the cost of food. We can encourage policies that help support farmers and agriculture so we can grow more food in our communities. Then there's also community solutions around how do we incentivize or support growing of food in community gardens, people using their own spaces to grow more food. We need more food security because we've seen as a result of the pandemic that our supply chains were at risk, and that meant that it was harder for us to bring in food and other resources. And if we're not able to produce some of the things that we need in our country domestically, like the equipment they need to keep our workers safe, if we're not able to produce food in our country, it really puts us at a vulnerable position. And so that's why we really want to encourage policies to allow for more domestic production of food.
Okay, that concludes the press conference. Thank you all.